As seen in an earlier chapter, our hunter-gatherer forebears evolved and survived during a time of many glacial and interglacial warming and cooling periods. Many earlier hominin species in the long line of the genus Homo evolved, added their distinctiveness, and went extinct. Some, like Neanderthals, as recently as 30,000 years ago. Their way of life enabled them to adapt, endure, and survive some of Earth's worst climate change events for hundreds of thousands of years. And this may have positioned them to survive climate change better than 21st century Homo sapiens appear to be today. Indeed, our hunter-gatherer forebears fled Africa to save themselves from near certain extinction, as climate change began to ravage their habitat at the end of the last ice age. They had neither climate science nor anything remotely resembling the sophistication Homo sapiens now have at their disposal to assess and respond to the climate data now available to warn of impending disaster. Nonetheless, they got themselves up and hightailed it out of Africa before it was too late. 70,000 years later, modern Homo sapiens is confronted by yet another climate change event, this time one we may have brought on ourselves. Yet, despite clear warnings that our forebears would have been lucky to have had, Homo sapiens today finds itself unwilling and unable to choose survival over capitalists' profits and the disappearing jobs that once came from fossil fuel-based industries, choosing instead to put the survival of our entire species at risk of extinction. At a time when the IPCC's 2018 report warns that averting a climate crisis will require a wholesale reinvention of the global economy, that the world must embark on a World War II-level effort to transition away from fossil fuels and start removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at large scales, anywhere from 400 billion to 1.6 trillion tons of it, and that a mere 10 or so years might be all the time left to avoid the potential ecological disaster possible above 1.5 degrees Celsius, one might expect, nay, hope, the fossil fuel industries would stand up and take notice. Instead, if their actions during the USA 2018 midterms are any indication, when they simply doubled down, they demonstrated clearly that the choices you and I care about just don't count. For example, Proposition 112 in Colorado sought to get new fossil fuel infrastructure set a bit farther away from schools, hospitals, residential neighborhoods, and water sources. But the oil industry launched a scorched earth response, spending more than $40 million to defeat the measure. And that was just one of many. In Washington state, oil companies spent another $25 million to defeat a proposal that would have required polluters to pay $15 per ton of greenhouse gases they spew into the atmosphere. And how about in Arizona, where the industry spent $30 million to defeat a measure to get the local utility to use more renewables? Or in California, where, in a single county, the industry spent $8 million to defeat a citizens' initiative to ban new fracking and drilling. And that's just in America. Is there any reason to hope for a retreat from drill, baby, drill? If Homo sapiens can't choose to take action to avoid a potential climate change-driven extinction in a democracy, then under what other form of government on Earth is this choice possible? And what is one to do when the leader of one's country, as in the USA, not only flat out denies there is a problem, but also has the power to force his views on everyone else? Trump's executive orders, the new Supreme Court justices he appointed, and the growing list of changes to U.S. science and environmental policies are essentially rolling back decades of the nation's efforts to limit and reduce fossil fuel usage, preserve habitats, species, and wildlife, ensure clean air and clean water, limit environmental pollution, and preserve the health and well-being of its citizens. Upon reviewing the announcement of the 2018 National Climate Assessment released around Thanksgiving of that year, the U.S. President proudly claimed he did not believe the report by his own government. If in the greatest democracy, the President and members of his cabinet and administration reject the warnings in this report and other scientific climate assessments, what options do a people have? How does a government of the people, by the people, and for the people end up as a government that's bent on destroying the people, the country, and the planet for the sake of fossil fuels and other environmentally destructive pursuits in the name of the people? If humans cannot secure this freedom by ballot or by elected officials, can they sue? Can lawsuits force governments and corporations to act on climate change? 21 young Americans ages 11 to 22 have sued the U.S. government over its failure to address climate change and are requesting that the government be ordered to act on climate change, asserting harm from carbon emissions. The federal government's motion to dismiss was denied, and the Supreme Court, after a brief stay, has allowed the case to proceed. Similar cases have begun to crop up around the world. A Dutch court, for instance, insisted that the state has a duty to protect against this real threat of climate change. There was, the Dutch court concluded after hearing scientific evidence from past IPCC reports, a real threat of dangerous climate change, resulting in the serious risk that the current generation of citizens will be confronted with loss of life and/or a disruption of family life. It insisted that the state has a duty to protect against this real threat, a duty of care enshrined in the European Convention on Human Rights. This might turn out to be an option for citizens in some Western countries. But what will happen in the rest of the world where the rule of law is not an option, and where even speaking out against one's government and powerful corporations, much less suing them, can leave one dead, like Jamal Khashoggi? While in some areas of the world there are encouraging signs of progress, it probably won't do to plug the carbon emission holes in just one or two corners of spaceship Earth. So again, one must ask, has Homo sapiens as a species lost its ability to choose to survive? Or is it just the few, once again choosing profits and using their power to block the survival choices of everyone else? Freedom and ability to migrate on Earth and to other planets and/or solar systems to survive. Just as the urge to reproduce is native to all Earth life, migration is a built-in response to existential threats. Yet it is the one evolutionary survival pattern modern Homo sapiens is completely incapable of executing to preserve itself. With no place left to go, it is more than likely that faced with the next species-wide, extinction-level event, the next great human survival migration will not be from Africa to Europe, but might have to be from Earth to another planet. However, it's clear Homo sapiens is neither capable nor ready to do that, and probably won't be for a very long time. Among the myriad areas innovation and research are focused on, Homo sapiens would do well to concentrate significantly more of its efforts and resources to achieving this ability. Having briefly explored these essential freedoms our forebears enjoyed for millions of years, it's now time to see how 21st century Homo sapiens freedoms compare in the following table. To assist with the assessment of our freedom to choose survival over extinction, one needs some way to qualitatively, if not quantitatively, describe what these essential freedoms are and how and when they became threatened and in danger of vanishing. if they are not already lost. If one assumes each essential freedom our hunter-gatherer forebears had is a baseline percentage that total 100% when added up, as shown in the table below, row 13, column 3, we can assign a fraction of that 100% as a value to each essential freedom, as shown in columns 2 and 3. Table 15.1. Essential freedoms hunter-gatherers enjoyed compared to 21st century Homo sapiens as a species and as individuals. Table 15.1 lists the 12 freedoms spoken of in this chapter. These freedoms are to be free, to be economically independent, to choose to eat healthy foods, from the need to own stuff, from big pharma and most diseases, from government, laws, and politics, from religions and belief in a god or gods, from profit-driven and extinction-capable innovations and R&D, to use only renewable energy sources, to choose to act to avoid climate change, to migrate to survive, and to choose to make a living within Earth's ecosystems without destroying Earth's species and habitats. Hunter-gatherers enjoyed all of these freedoms, and so they score 100%. Homo sapiens as a species has lost many of these freedoms, and so they score 8%. As individuals, Homo sapiens are slightly more free, but still significantly less than hunter-gatherers, scoring 21%. Similarly, based on the percentage value assigned each hunter-gatherer essential freedom, we can estimate and allocate a fraction of that as a percentage for each corresponding freedom a 21st century human, column 4, and our entire species, column 5, might have today. Hence, the columns Homo sapiens species and Homo sapiens individual show an estimated fraction of the percentage assigned, in column 3, to each of the essential freedoms listed in the first column. Estimates for essential freedoms in column 4, species, and column 5, individuals, need not be constrained to total 100%. While these are assumed estimates, it is hoped by playing around with different estimates in columns 4 and 5 for each essential freedom today, one should be able to see how these might differ from the initial hunter-gatherer values allocated to the essential freedoms in columns 2 and 3. And yes, these are arbitrary estimates, but they represent a sense of how our freedoms today exceed, equal, or have faded over Homo sapiens history, leaving our species at risk of no longer being free, willing, and able to choose to survive when, not if, confronted by that inevitable existential threat. They are just one person's take. You might have an entirely different take, and that's fine too. Give it a whirl. The takeaway here is 1. These are freedoms that have been preempted by the few, freedoms our forebears had but which we mostly lack. And 2. What that means when a choice to survive must be made, and that choice cuts across the economic interest of the few. Does Homo sapiens as a species, or do we as individuals still retain the essential freedom our forebears had to choose survival over extinction when faced with an existential threat? Can 21st century Homo sapiens stand up today, right now, and vigorously fight climate change the way our forebears, 70,000 years ago, stood up and fled Africa to escape habitat loss brought on by climate change at the end of the last ice age, and so saved themselves and thereby us? We wouldn't be here if they hadn't, and generations X, Y, and Z probably won't remain here if we don't. They did, and we must, so our species might attain evolutionary maturity and thereby survival. Post-agriculture hunter-gatherers, and thereby Homo sapiens, appear to have lost most of their freedoms with the transition to agriculture, settled communities, and the consequent rise of civilization. It was from these early times that the few, or governments and their rulers, priests, the elite, bureaucrats, and later craftsmen and traders, began appropriating for themselves the produce, labor, and freedoms of the rest, while relegating them to the basement of the civilization they had built. Kings and queens, some still existing, mostly became nation-state sovereigns, dictators, and military strongmen. Priests led to organized religions with offshoots that became institutions of learning, like universities. The elite and bureaucrats became the wealthy. Traders became the business class, companies and multinationals. Money changers are now our financial institutions, and craftsmen are our technology builders. What these all have in common is a transfer of the freedoms of the individual members of our species to institutions and organizations headed by the few. Whereas hunter-gatherers and his small group chose their own way and were in control of every aspect of their own lives, today, the permission of some self-appointed authority or bureaucrat is needed to do almost anything. The food one eats, the clothes one wears, where and how one lives, works, travels, gets an education, whom one chooses to love, marry, if one is even lucky enough to live in a country where marrying the person of choice is allowed, and have children with, how and whether one chooses to worship a god. It is all cocooned in a web of traditions, customs, regulations, and religions and other laws that vary from nation to nation and control one's every action. That's not even mentioning the laws that govern one's death. Homo sapiens went from being born free and living free, owing allegiance to no one with total freedom to choose, to today, being at best law-abiding and subject to the rule of law, or at worst, subject to racism, outright ethnic cleansing, state-directed persecution, economic and political hostility, death, or forced migration to survive. This heist of Homo sapiens' freedoms included from being one that called all the shots and owed allegiance to neither man, king, queen, nor any other ruler, to being a mere servant, peasant, slave, or military conscript. From once being free and able to choose survival, as our forebears did, to being an insignificant voice with little to no ability to influence this choice or to change outcomes. From the economic freedom and independence of hunting and gathering to economic dependency on a landlord farmer as a landless peasant or slave. From the freedom to make a living within Earth's ecosystems to working for the man on a farm outside those ecosystems. From hunting and gathering to support family and group, to farming to support kings, queens, priests, the elite, bureaucrats, craftsmen, and traders with the surplus grain produced. From little work and nearly unlimited leisure time to unending, back-breaking work with little to no leisure or free time. From freedom to live virtually anywhere to essentially being chained exclusively to a particular patch of land. From an era of plenty and a free, healthy, and well-fed lifestyle to one of poverty with a constant risk of failed crops, starvation, malnutrition, and deficiency diseases. From a largely healthy and mostly disease-free lifestyle to one plagued by animal diseases, unhealthy living conditions, and improper, unsanitary disposal of human, food, and animal waste. From an organic, secure, reliable, multi-source food supply that enabled a healthy, nutritional diet, to inadequate nutrition from a limited number of agricultural crops. And today, government of the people, for the people, and by the people has turned out to be the decline and fall of all the people, perpetrated by some of the people upon the rest of the people. This is not just an accident of history or an inadvertent transfer of these freedoms, but a deliberate power grab, as deliberate as that of the exploitative European colonialists and today's multinationals that continue to prey upon countries and their peoples. This was outright theft that created such economic dependency and loss of economic freedom and independence that it remains highly doubtful whether the rest of 21st century Homo sapiens, as individuals or as a species, still retain any freedom to choose survival over extinction. Given the current existential threats Homo sapiens faces, and the apparent lack of desire by the few to change course or implement appropriate and timely responses to avert them, what can or should the rest of Homo sapiens do? Is it still possible to choose to survive? And if so, can we regain enough of our freedoms to make that choice? As noted in the beginning of this chapter, at some point during its evolution, an intelligent species will inevitably be confronted with at least one existential threat, and it must be free, willing, and able to choose to survive to avoid extinction. Today, the Homo sapiens species is confronted not by one, but by numerous existential threats. As stated earlier, making this choice will not only be the most important conscious decision we as a species will ever have to make, but more important, it might be the sole reason for our existence in the first place. Failing to choose to survive won't be merely choosing to fail. It will be choosing to go extinct as a species. The key issue arising from this chapter is, given the clear preference of the few in control of Spaceship Earth to stay the course, if it isn't already too late, what might the rest of humanity do to regain enough of these stolen freedoms so as to make that fateful choice in time to survive? If Homo sapiens were to regain its freedom to choose, in the next chapter, we explore how it might redirect its civilization to ensure survival over extinction. Chapter 16. From Civilization to Equalization. Going back to the past to save the future. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Preamble to the United States Constitution. It is not every day one gets to design or specify the laws that would govern a new nation, let alone an entire civilization. But in 1776, the American founding fathers tried their hand at defining what came to be known as the American Constitution, the preamble to which began as shown above. It was signed on September 17, 1787. By delegates of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. To date, there are 27 constitutional amendments, and while it might still be regarded, though fast becoming less so, by many as being a better guide than most other governments, it is also becoming increasingly unclear whether, 240 plus years later, it can continue to serve as that guide for we the people. America was not the first or only country or nation to come up with a set of laws and rules to guide itself. Yet, notwithstanding these laws and constitutions developed by countless empires, kingdoms, authoritarian governments, and dictators, our species still finds itself unable to create a set of rules or laws that can steer nations away from collapse, and a civilization capable of avoiding self-extinction. Rules and laws that, if followed, can ensure the survival of we the people. Why is that so? Why is that so? Have you heard of anyone who did not spend some time in a womb, or did not need parents to come into the world? No one, not even the framers of the Constitution, gets to choose whether one needs parents, or who will be one's parents, or the town, city, state, or country where one is born. Yet parents always turn out to be humans, and that place of birth is never on another planet, but always somewhere on planet Earth. Why is that always so, too? And those are not the only constants that accompanied Homo sapiens' evolution that we take for granted. The day is always 24 hours, and the year 365 days, more or less. Because Earth revolves on its axis, we can count on the sun rising and setting like clockwork, just as we can count on the rotation of seasons because it orbits the sun. Similarly, we have come to expect numerous varieties of plants to grow and bear fruit, whether we plant them or not. And animals, birds, fish, reptiles, and amphibians will be born, grow, and continue to supply the food chain. And thankfully, this all happens without requiring an amendment to the Constitution, or edict of an emperor or king now long gone, or even the fiat of an almighty God. Why is this always so? Clearly, embedded among the forces of the universe are the rules and patterns of evolution, repeating processes that work together to ensure the continuity of species, whose existence and survival depend upon these processes occurring without fail. There is a reason no one goes to bed worrying whether or not the sun will rise tomorrow, or whether spring will follow winter next year. But more and more of us have begun to seriously worry about how high the global temperature and sea level will rise by next summer. Again, why is that so? Something obviously changed. One or more of those planetary autonomic evolutionary processes, which functioned like clockwork for hundreds of millennia, have begun to behave differently. And we are the ones driving the change. What else have we tinkered with? You guessed it. The survival-driven laws and patterns an intelligent species civilization should follow if it's to avoid self-extinction and survive. Civilizations, like bacteria colonies and anthills, are not designed or created by edicts or constitutions. They evolve. In almost every case, species, even intelligent species, are driven by the need to survive. They may end up taking on a characteristic shape or behavior pattern. They appear to grow and converge around familiar forms and patterns we have come to recognize, and in many cases seem to follow repeating rules. So predictable are some rules and patterns that, when imitated, as farmers often do, outcomes are similar to those that evolve naturally. In some cases, we have discovered patterns and deciphered rules, like those that fashion a leaf, design a snowflake, or sketch an anthill. But we have yet, it seems, to find and imitate those that can guide an intelligent species civilization away from self-extinction. If the patterns and rules we follow to build our civilizations are laid down by evolution, the outcome will be survival. If, on the contrary, they are derived from our non-survival-driven constitutions and laws, they will continue to fail and lead to collapse, and eventually to self-extinction. By now, it should have become clear that all of nature's flora and fauna, including ourselves, continue to survive not as a result of the laws and constitutions our species has conjured up, but only because our very existence is itself a continuing automatic execution of evolution's survival rules and patterns, such as the rotation of the planet or its revolving around the sun. Apart from such planetary autonomic systems, evolution appears to have set on automatic with their ability to ensure our survival. What other evolutionary rules and patterns might an intelligent species seek out and follow to evolve a civilization that leads to survival rather than extinction? It's also clear most species have gone extinct, but none by self-extinction. This means that if species can avoid self-extinction, and in addition can adapt, innovate, mature, and migrate to escape the universe's existential threats, as intelligent species have the ability to do, extinction can be avoided altogether. Surely Homo sapiens can follow these patterns and rules to avoid extinction. Yet doing so has obviously not been as easy as it sounds. And here is why. All Earth life species that avoided self-extinction were only able to do so because they remained in and followed the rules of the ecosystems in which they evolved. Homo sapiens, on the contrary, is the only Earth life species that has abandoned the ecosystem and, perhaps as a consequence, has now ended up potentially engineering the means to its own extinction. Evolving and remaining in the ecosystem is then the only way for Earth life species, including Homo sapiens, to survive. As the human body is regulated by the internal biological processes of homeostasis, so energy flows and nutrient recycling regulate and enable species survival within an ecosystem. Similarly, as the rotation of the planet and its revolving around the sun supports Earth life survival at the planetary level, so does the flow of energy and nutrient recycling within the Earth's ecosystem enable survival at the habitat and ecosystem levels. Indeed, almost everything in the universe, it would seem, needs to evolve and exist within some kind of cradle, an enclosure or framework wherein forces, energy, and matter can interact to enable evolution and survival. Galaxies can evolve and exist only in a universe that provides the context, material, and forces that enable their formation and continued existence. Stars tend to form and thrive within stellar nurseries. Planets evolve from the dust and planetesimals that accrete to form an emerging solar system. Habitats capable of supporting the evolution of complex animal and intelligent species life are likely to form on planets in a solar system that orbit within the continuous habitable zone of their home star. Similarly, species can evolve within ecosystems that form within those habitats, as they did on Earth, and it is in these ecosystems the evolutionary forces that enable species evolution and survival converge. Earth's ecosystems vary by environment. Forests, grasslands, deserts, and tundra, to name a few of land environments, and freshwater, marine, wetlands, mangroves, and coral reefs, to name a few of the aquatic environments. As there needed to be a universe for galaxies to exist, galaxies for stars to exist, stars for solar systems and planets to exist, planets for habitats to exist, and habitats for ecosystems to exist. So there must be ecosystems for species to evolve and survive. One should expect it to be as problematic for species to survive outside ecosystems whence they evolved, as it must be for life to evolve and survive on a planet revolving outside the continuously habitable zone, aka the Goldilocks zone, around its star. What the Goldilocks zone is to habitable planets, ecosystems are to species evolution and survival. Not surprising, too, this pattern of life needing to evolve and survive in enclosures fit for purpose is also seen in the evolution of species, including the human female's womb. That's why we've all started there. And even down to the cellular life, as in eukaryotic cells, where the genetic code, the very machinery of life, is stored. And as physiological processes in the human body exist to operate, maintain, and regulate the relatively constant conditions of the body's properties, so too does the ecosystem for the species sharing its environment. Ecosystems, among other things, are a critical component of the biosphere and recycle the biologically important elements species need to survive. As homeostatic regulation within the human body turns out to be critical to its continued survival, so too staying within and following the rules of the ecosystem are indispensable to all Earth life species' survival, including Homo sapiens. So, here are a few takeaways about species that live within and follow the laws of the ecosystem and habitats wherein they evolved. 1. They find the sustenance for their lives from within the ecosystem in which they evolved. 2. Their adaptations, innovations, maturing, and migrations are enabled and choreographed by the rules of and done within the ecosystem. 3. They destroy neither ecosystems nor habitats in which they evolved. 4. All their actions, everything they do, are survival-driven. 5. Their method of living ensures a sharing of the resources of the ecosystem and habitat in a way that allows for the mutual survival of participating species. And 6. They drive neither themselves nor other species to extinction. On the contrary, none of the above can be said for Homo sapiens, the lone surviving intelligent Earth life species that has chosen to live outside Earth's ecosystems. Like Elvis, Homo sapiens has left the ecosystem, and the consequences are plain for all to see. Built into every species, except our own, it would seem, is this evolutionary restraint, a kind of built-in live and let live instinct of having to live within the Earth's ecosystems without destroying them, other species, and themselves. And that is exactly what all species have done since each evolved, including our hunter-gatherer forebears over the millions of years of their existence. Modern Homo sapiens, their descendants, became the first and so far only Earth life species to change this evolutionary survival equation by choosing farming as its way to sustain its life, and thereby ended up doing so outside of the Earth's ecosystems. It was this seemingly simple change that was the root cause of, and led to, the kind of civilization our species has evolved, and the conditions with which 21st century Homo sapiens now wrestles. Today, our species has begun, once more, to tweak that evolutionary equation, this time by rapidly driving up atmospheric CO2 content, thereby increasing global warming, and yet again changing the conditions in Earth's ecosystems and habitats, rendering some incapable of sustaining life, and driving many species to extinction. Herein, then, lie the root causes of all the problems confronting 21st century Homo sapiens civilization. First, the transition to farming as the predominant subsistence method, a choice to maintain their lives from outside of the Earth's ecosystems. And second, the choice to extract and burn fossil fuels as a source of energy, essentially short-circuiting the long-term carbon cycle by prematurely returning to the atmosphere the CO2 evolution had sequestered within the Earth over geologic time. The choice to farm and the choice to use fossil fuels stand like towering bookends on either side of the last 10,000 years of our species' civilization. Any attempt to redirect 21st century Homo sapiens civilization onto a path that ends in survival must begin at the farm and run all the way through to the fuel pump. Above, we asked, is there a way Homo sapiens might build a civilization that does not end up destroying Earth's species, habitats, and potentially itself? What this question really translates to is, how should our species change the way it adapts, innovates, matures, and migrates if it wants to avoid extinction? How can humans re-assimilate into local ecosystems instead of living outside of them? Begin to collaborate and integrate with other species instead of driving them to extinction, and begin to sustain Earth's habitats so they might, in turn, sustain us. Indeed, how? We already know that no human constitution, law, decree, or set of religious commandments and practices will suffice. None has so far. Instead, each day that the sun rises, the seasons change, and the earth continues to offer its bounty of plants and animals. We have proof that those evolutionary rules and patterns that energize Earth's habitats, ecosystems, and biosphere are always at work. Built into every evolutionary system and species is the set of rules it needs to follow to survive. And, like all species, Homo sapiens also has that built-in urge to survive. We simply need to reawaken, reprioritize, and re-elevate that survival urge so it becomes, once again, the overarching motive that drives all our actions as a species, as it once did our hunter-gatherer forebears. However, this survival urge needs to be pointed in the right direction. And in Chapter 13, we referred to this direction as our true north and identified a test that, like a compass, can point us in that survival-driven direction. We called it the Survivability and Habitat Sustainability Test. It's how, as a species, our hunter-gatherer forebears found and stayed on the path to survival. And we can once again use it to evaluate and prioritize what's really important to our species' survival. Nothing gets done if it fails to drive species, habitat, and Homo sapiens' survival. It's that simple. When we follow our true north, we will steer clear of the pursuit of profits, wealth accumulation, and market growth, and instead get back on the road that leads to evolutionary sustainability and survival. Getting there is what the rest of this chapter explores. It is the essential question Homo sapiens must now ask and answer before it's too late. How differently might civilization have turned out if, like their hunter-gatherer forebears, early humans had continued living within the Earth's ecosystems, preserving its habitats and countless species from extinction, and itself from creating the means of its own extinction? We might never know. Instead, we chose to adapt. Adaptation is the first of the evolutionary species' survival patterns. Adapt, innovate, mature, and migrate to survive, or go extinct, discussed in earlier chapters. We have seen how, since choosing to live outside of the Earth's ecosystems, potentially the first Homo sapiens adaptation, each successive adaptation became the source of a new set of issues, and how each succeeding fix led to deeper and more complex adaptations and problems. Agriculture eventually led to genetically modified crops. Fertilizers and simple manure morphed into chemical fertilizers and deadly pollutants, such as herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides. Going even further, we have beaten our plowshares not only into swords, but also into AR-15s and AK-47s. Our pruning hooks not only into spears, but also into nuclear-tipped warheads on intercontinental ballistic missiles, with North Korea the latest in the growing club of nations with the potential, to varying degrees, to end civilization as we know it. What began as seemingly common sense adaptations were followed by innumerable others across all aspects of an emerging civilization: economic, political, religious, social, cultural, technological, scientific, and more. These adaptations have today brought our species face to face with the reality that we have become the architects of the means of our own potential extinction. Could we have known that taking so seemingly simple a step as farming would eventually, 10,000 or so years later, land us here? Next in these species survival patterns came the trio of innovate, mature, and migrate, indispensable preambles to a successful outcome in the survival versus extinction decision each species must confront. And in the chapter on innovation, we saw that while Homo sapiens' innovations accelerated exponentially, the number of individuals necessary to drive our species to extinction had plummeted inversely. This occurs when innovation greatly outgrows maturity and exposes an unmistakable correlation between a rapid advance in innovation without a corresponding growth in an intelligent species' maturity. We saw, too, how the maturity/self-extinction index in Chapter 13, Evolutionary Maturity, shows the closest we got to the self-extinction indication, asymptotically approaching zero evolutionary maturity, was in 1945. On July 16th of that year, J. Robert Oppenheimer, head of the Manhattan Project, witnessed the first detonation of a nuclear weapon, which he had developed. He said later the experience brought to his mind the famous quote from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." On that day, Homo sapiens entered a new phase in its civilization. It had innovated the means of its own potential extinction. How is it that evolution's first and potentially only nascent intelligent technological species on Earth, perhaps in the galaxy, evolved with the innate intelligence to choose either survival or extinction, but seems so unable to mature, and even less able to migrate to survive, while growing increasingly capable of and seemingly bent on self-extinction? It was Jane Goodall, the primatologist, most known for her long-term study of wild chimpanzees in Tanzania, who remarked, "The most intellectual creature to ever walk Earth is destroying its only home." What is it about our species that has driven us to the edge of this survival-extinction precipice, that has led us to develop a civilization that appears to be headed to self-extinction? Isn't there another way an intelligent species can build a civilization that does not require destroying Earth's species, habitats, and potentially itself in the process? Is there a way to solve evolution's equation of life other than the way Homo sapiens seems to have chosen? There has to be another way, and indeed, there is. Homo sapiens already know of this way. It's the way our hunter-gatherer forebears lived for millions of years without driving themselves to this survival extinction precipice. It's also the way all other species have followed. And since there is such a way, can we rediscover and follow it to ensure our survival as they did theirs? The answers are yes, and maybe. Yes, there is such a way, and we have already rediscovered it. This book, for instance, has identified and outlined that way, describing the evolutionary survival patterns and a species survival maturity model, which, like that yellow brick road Dorothy followed, can guide us, as it did our forebears, all the way past the point of self-extinction. And maybe, because we may not be prepared to abandon our current path to make the fundamental changes necessary to follow this new way. To identify these necessary changes, one must first be able to describe two very different ways to survive. In this book, they are referred to as civilization and equalization. Equalization is the way our ancestors lived as hunter-gatherers, sustaining their lives inside rather than outside Earth's ecosystems for millions of years before civilization began. Civilization came after, and is what Homo sapiens called what followed the transition to agriculture, and began only 10,000 years ago. And from everything we have seen so far in this book, the road to Homo sapiens' survival points not to more of the civilization we have had since that transition, but might well be a return to equalization. Should that turn out to be the case, then Homo sapiens, like Marty McFly in Back to the Future, might have to return to its past to save its future, and itself from self-extinction. If it's reasonable to assume that given half a chance, Homo sapiens would choose survival over extinction, then our ultimate and overarching goal as an emerging intelligent species cannot be to go extinct, but rather to survive, and hence the choices we make must align with that goal. But, as we have seen in Chapter 15, Freedom to Choose, Homo sapiens' choices may no longer be our own to make, and our current choices are definitely not in alignment with a desire to survive. This is so because our ability to choose has been hijacked by a small subset of our species, the few, whose choices are entirely orthogonal to the evolutionary requirements for survival. This means our species might well have lost the ability to even choose to alter its current civilization to survive. More than likely, then, it won't be easy for Homo sapiens to make the needed civilizational changes to ensure survival, unless and until one of these things occurs. Control is successfully wrestled away from the few in time to make the needed changes, or civilization collapses. This collapse could be due to any number of causes, such as global epidemics, like COVID-19, a planet-wide calamity, or global warfare that brings an end to the control of the few, enabling survivors, if any, to change course. Some think there is also the possibility of persuading the few that it is in their own self-interest to relent and abandon their planet and species-destroying mania for profits and economic growth. However, others, pointing to their unwillingness to even explore capping fossil fuel use, think that such a change, even if possible, is unlikely to occur before it's too late. The way forward, then, remains unclear. But should Homo sapiens emerge free, willing, and able to once again make its own decisions, as our forebears did 70,000 years ago to leave Africa to survive, how might we go about rebuilding a civilization that won't lead to making the same mistakes? We have all seen movies with actors caught in a time loop, the same scenes repeating again and again, each time ending in the same disastrous outcome until something happens to break this cycle. Unfortunately, like those repeating scenes, so too has hominins' evolution and Homo sapiens' civilizations played out over geologic time, with modern Homo sapiens the last man standing. We too could end up making the same mistakes that ended each time in extinction unless we can find a way to break free. We must peer into the past to see more clearly what the future might hold. Throughout this book, we have explored Homo sapiens' past to find the evolutionary survival patterns that choreographed our species' existence over geologic time. Hopefully, we can use those patterns to break free from this endless cycle of extinction. One way to use the past to better see the future is to compare the outcome of that past with present and potential near-future outcomes, and see where each has led and might still lead. That is the approach taken in this concluding chapter. While we've already looked at how making a living outside Earth's ecosystems has led us to the very edge of a survival-extinction precipice, we have not yet thought much about the kind of outcome that could emerge if Homo sapiens were to, instead, try the evolutionary way of sustaining life within the Earth's ecosystems and without destroying them, or driving other species, and potentially our own, to extinction. Keeping in mind evolution's survival-first goals, aligned with most Homo sapiens' desire for survival, we ask in this chapter what a Homo sapiens civilization would look like under the live and let live evolutionary constraints of equalization. What might be the outcome, and how would it differ from what we already have today? While it might not be possible to spell out the specifics of such a civilization, there are clear indications of its guiding principles. One can compare the outcome of our forebears' millions of years of existence as hunter-gatherers, sustaining their lives from within the Earth's ecosystems, or equalization, with civilization, the outcome of Homo sapiens' existence outside of the Earth's ecosystems since the transition to agriculture. One can compare various aspects of the two, such as their respective fundamental principles, values and motivations, guiding laws, life's focus and ambitions, individual and species goals, economic freedoms and independence, political freedoms and independence, adaptations and innovations, freedom and ability to migrate to survive, and freedom and ability to choose survival over extinction when faced with an existential threat. Having done so, one could draw conclusions about which of these is best suited for attaining evolution's and Homo sapiens' overarching goal of survival. Still, you say, I am having difficulty seeing how such a comparison can help our species get to survival, unless our species is able to regain control of its ability and freedom to choose, or has to pick up and start over after a civilization collapse. Indeed, a mere comparison wouldn't do any of that. Yet, should either occur, the following thoughts may help jumpstart rebuilding a Homo sapiens civilization around equalization, the evolutionary way our forebears successfully sustained their lives for millions of years without the threat of self-extinction. The following table, then, groups a few key life-impacting civilization categories for contrast and comparison. It looks at and asks, given these two very different approaches to sustaining life on planet Earth that equalization versus civilization requires, which is more or less likely to drive Homo sapiens' survival versus extinction? It is not intended to be comprehensive, but merely to point a direction and start the conversation. It begins with a definition of equalization and civilization and compares these across the following categories: fundamental and guiding principles and what motivates Homo sapiens; values, how is nature viewed; guiding laws,